There are moments in life that split your world into before and after, and I'm about to tell you about mine. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon when a woman named Ophelia Maxwell walked into my garage, and 3 hours later looked me straight in the eye and said, "I'm 51. Is it wrong that I dream about you every night?" But let me start from the beginning. Because the confession that changed everything didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened after I'd spent the afternoon elbow deep in her engine, thinking I was just fixing a car. My name is Martin Hartwell, and I've been running Hartwell Auto Repair on the outskirts of Cedar Falls for the better part of 15 years. It's not much to look at a converted warehouse with 3 bays. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Oil stains that have become part of the concrete's personality, and a perpetual smell of motor oil mixed with the industrial coffee I brew too strong and drink too often. But it's mine, and in a world where everything feels temporary, that matters. Thursday, October 12th started like any other day. The morning rush had been typical. Mrs. Chen's Camry needed an oil change. The Ferguson kid brought in his pickup truck with what he swore was just a small noise, but turned out to be a transmission crying for mercy. And I'd spent 2 hours explaining to Mr. Rodriguez why his 2003 Buick wasn't worth the $3,000 repair estimate he was hoping to avoid. Standard stuff. The kind of day where you work with your hands, solve problems, and go home satisfied that you've fixed more things than you've broken. I was just finishing up the paperwork on the Ferguson truck, wiping grease off my hands with a rag that had seen better decades, when I heard the sound that would later replay in my memory 1,000 times, the soft purr of a well-maintained engine pulling into my lot, followed by the distinctive click of heels on concrete. I looked up to see a silver BMW sedan, probably a 2018 or 2019 model, parking carefully between the lines like someone who respects both machinery and boundaries. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a woman who immediately changed the energy of my entire workspace. Ophelia Maxwell was 51 years old, though I wouldn't learn that detail until much later in our conversation. What I noticed first was the way she moved, purposeful but unhurried, like someone who had learned to navigate the world on her own terms. She wore a charcoal wool coat that looked expensive, but not flashy, dark jeans that fit well, and low heels that made that confident. Clicking sound I'd heard from inside the garage. Her hair was a rich auburn with streaks of silver she didn't try to hide, pulled back in a way that was professional but not severe. But it was her eyes that caught me, intelligent, direct, and carrying just a hint of something I couldn't quite identify. Worry, maybe, or hope. "Are you Martin?" she asked as she approached, her voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested either too much coffee or too many late nights.
Ow.
I called earlier about the strange noise my car's been making. Setting down my clipboard, "That's me." "You must be Mrs. Maxwell. What kind of noise are we talking about?" She gestured toward her BMW with a slight grimace. "It's hard to describe. It starts about 10 minutes into driving, sounds like. Grinding, but not constant. More like something's catching every few seconds. My regular mechanic is booked solid for 2 weeks, and honestly, the noise is making me nervous about driving." I appreciated that she didn't minimize the problem or try to self-diagnose. Too many customers come in either convinced their car is dying when it just needs an oil change, or insisting it's just a small thing when their engine is 3 miles from catastrophic failure. "Let's take a look," I said, pulling on my work gloves. "When did you first notice it?" "About a week ago. Started subtle, but it's getting more frequent." She handed me the keys, and I noticed her fingers were steady. No nervous fidgeting. I know enough about cars to know that grinding sounds are never good news. "Smart woman," I said, and meant it. Most people wait until their car stops running, entirely before they bring it in. As I popped the hood and began my initial inspection, Ophelia didn't hover like many customers do. Instead, she found a clean spot on my workbench and settled in to wait, pulling out a paperback book from her purse. I caught a glimpse of the cover, something about psychology and human behavior. She noticed me looking. "Occupational reading," she said with a small smile. "I'm a therapist. Always trying to understand what makes people tick." Interesting work, I replied, turning my attention back to her engine. This must be challenging, helping people sort through their problems all day. It is, but it's also rewarding when you can help someone see their situation more clearly. She paused, then added, though sometimes the people who spend their days helping others are the ones who need help seeing their own lives clearly. There was something in the way she said it that made me glance up from the engine bay. For just a moment, her professional composure slipped, and I caught a glimpse of something vulnerable underneath. But then she was back to her book, and I was back to diagnosing her car. The problem wasn't immediately obvious, which meant I'd need to take the car for a test drive and possibly put it on the lift for a more thorough inspection. I explained this to Ophelia, expecting her to ask about timing and costs like most customers do. Instead, she simply nodded and said, "Whatever it takes. I trust your judgment." Trust. Such a simple word, but in my line of work, it's everything. Most people come in suspicious, expecting to be taken advantage of. Ophelia Maxwell looked at me like she'd already decided I was someone worth trusting. And that did something strange to my chest, a tightening that had nothing to do with the physical work ahead. "This might take a couple hours," I warned her. "There's a coffee shop down the street if you want to wait somewhere more comfortable." "Actually," she said, closing her book and looking around my garage with genuine interest, "would it bother you if I stayed? I find watching skilled people work fascinating. Professional curiosity, I suppose." And that's how I ended up spending the afternoon with Ophelia Maxwell watching me work, asking thoughtful questions about engines and mechanics, while I slowly diagnosed her car and found myself increasingly curious about the woman who drove. Neither of us knew that in a few hours she would tell me about dreams that would change everything I thought I understood about human connection. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what happened next. The first thing I learned about Ophelia Maxwell was that she wasn't like other customers. While I ran through my standard diagnostic routine, she didn't pace impatiently or check her phone every 30 seconds. Instead, she sat on that workbench with her book open, but I noticed her eyes following my movements more than the words on the page. "What are you looking for first?" she asked, as I connected my diagnostic scanner to her BMW's computer system. "Cars are basically computers on wheels," I explained, waiting for the scanner to boot up. "They track everything: engine performance, transmission behavior, brake system health. If something's wrong, there's usually a code stored somewhere that'll point me in the right direction. Like a patient's medical history," she said thoughtfully. "The symptoms tell you where to look, but the underlying data tells you what's really happening." I glanced up, surprised by the analogy. Exactly like that. Most people think fixing cars is all about muscle and intuition, but half the job is detective work. The scanner finished its check and displayed the results. No stored error codes, which meant whatever was causing that grinding noise was either intermittent or happening in a system the computer didn't monitor directly. "Clean bill of health from the computer," I told her, "which means we need to do this the old-fashioned way. I'm going to take her for a test drive, see if I can replicate the problem." Ophelia nodded and stood up. "Mind if I come along? I can point out exactly when it happens." I hesitated. Taking customers on test drives wasn't standard practice. Insurance liability, professional boundaries, all that. But something about her calm confidence made the usual concerns seem trivial. "Sure," I said, wiping my hands clean. "But I should warn you, I'm not the most exciting driver. I tend to go slow and listen hard." "Perfect," she said with a smile that reached her eyes. "I've had enough excitement in my life. Slow and careful sounds, refreshing." We climbed into her BMW, and I immediately noticed how well maintained it was. The interior smelled like leather conditioner and vanilla subtle. Expensive. The seat was adjusted perfectly for someone about 5'6", and there was a travel mug in the cup holder that still smelled like coffee. Personal details that painted a picture of someone organized, someone who took care of her things. "Nice car," I said, adjusting the mirrors. "You've taken good care of it, as it was a gift to myself when I turned 50, she said, buckling her seatbelt. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I spent so many years driving practical cars because that's what responsible people do. Then I realized life's too short to spend it driving something that doesn't make you smile. I pulled out of the garage and onto the main road, keeping the windows down despite the October chill so I could hear every sound the engine made. For the first few minutes, everything sounded normal. The smooth purr of a well-tuned V6. The subtle hum of properly balanced tires on asphalt. "Tell me about your work," I said as we drove through downtown Cedar Falls. "What kind of therapy do you do?" "Marriage counseling, mostly. Some individual therapy. But couples work is my specialty." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "There's something fascinating about watching two people try to rebuild trust after it's been broken. The mechanics of human relationships, if you will. It must be tough seeing relationships fall apart all day. Actually, I see more relationships getting repaired than destroyed. People come to me when they still have hope, when they still think there's something worth saving. By the time they're in my office, they've already decided to fight for what they have." As if summoned by our conversation about relationships, the grinding noise started. It was subtle at first, just a small catch in the engine's rhythm, but as we continued driving, it became more pronounced. "There," Ophelia said, pointing at the dashboard like the sound was visible. "That's exactly what I've been hearing." I pulled into a parking lot and popped the hood, listening carefully as the engine idled. The noise was definitely coming from the front of the engine, but it wasn't constant. Every 8 to 10 seconds, there it was, brief grinding sound like metal touching metal. "It's not the belt," I muttered, checking the serpentine belt for wear or misalignment. "And it's not the alternator bearing." Ophelia got out and stood beside me, surprisingly close given that most people avoid getting near running engines. What else could it be? Few possibilities. Could be the water pump starting to fail. Could be a pulley bearing. Might even be something in the timing chain assembly.
Ow.
I shut off the engine and looked at her. The good news is, none of those are catastrophic failures if we catch them early. The bad news is, I'll need to get it up on the lift and take a closer look. How long will that take? I checked my watch. It was already past 3 o'clock, and I had another appointment at 4:30. Probably an hour, maybe 2, if I need to remove some components to get a better look. You're welcome to wait, but like I said, there's not much to entertain you. "Here, actually," she said, leaning against the car with a thoughtfulness that suggested she was working through something in her mind. "I'd like to stay and watch if that's okay. I find there's something therapeutic about watching someone solve problems methodically." "Therapeutic for who?" I asked with a grin. "You or me?" She laughed, and it was a real laugh, not the polite chuckle people give mechanics to seem friendly. "Maybe both of us. I spend my days helping people untangle emotional problems. There's something appealing about watching someone untangle mechanical ones. It's more straightforward cause and effect." As we drove back to the garage, I found myself stealing glances at her profile. There's something about Ophelia Maxwell that intrigued me beyond her politeness or her unusual interest in watching me work. She had this quality of ... presence, I guess. Like she was someone who had learned to be comfortable with herself. Comfortable with silence. Comfortable with letting things unfold without rushing them. I had no idea that in the next few hours, I would learn just how much she had been thinking about me, and how her dreams had been anything but straightforward. Back at the garage, I positioned Ophelia's BMW over the hydraulic lift and began the process of raising it up. The familiar whir of the motor and the mechanical clunk of the safety locks engaging created a rhythm I'd heard thousands of times, but today it felt different. Maybe it was because I had an audience who seemed genuinely interested in the process. Or maybe it was something else I couldn't quite identify. "This is impressive," Ophelia said, walking around the lifted car and examining it from underneath. I had no idea how complex the underside of a car really is. "Most people don't," I said, pulling on my work light and positioning it to illuminate. "The engine bay from below, everyone sees the pretty exterior, but all the real work happens in places you can't see unless you know where to look." She paused at that comment, giving me a thoughtful look. That's true about a lot of things in life, isn't it? The important stuff usually happens beneath the surface.
I was about to respond when my phone rang.
The caller ID showed Nelson's parts, which meant my supplier was probably calling about a delayed shipment. I almost ignored it, but then remembered I was waiting on critical parts for 2 other jobs. I need to take this, I told Ophelia. Sorry, it'll just be a minute. The call turned into a 10-minute negotiation about delivery schedules and substitute parts. When I finally hung up, I found Ophelia standing near my small office area. Looking at the framed photos I kept on a filing cabinet, most were of cars. I'd restored over the years, but there were a few personal ones mixed in. Is this your family? She asked, pointing to a photo of me with an older couple at what looked like a barbecue. My parents, I said, joining her at the cabinet. It was taken last summer at their 40th anniversary party. They still live in the house where I grew up, about 2 hours north of here. They look happy, she said, studying the photo.
And
proud. I'm guessing they're proud of you too. They worry more than they're proud, I admitted. They keep asking when I'm going to settle down, give them grandchildren, all that. They can't understand why I'm happy running a garage instead of pursuing something more ... conventional. Ophelia turned from the photos to look at me directly. Are you happy? It was such a simple question, but it caught me off guard. Most people ask what you do for work, where you live, whether you're married. Nobody just asks if you're happy. Most. Days, yeah, I said after thinking about it. I like solving problems, like working with my hands. I like that when someone brings me something broken, I can usually fix it and hand it back to them working better than when they brought it in. That's a rare gift, she said quietly, being able to fix things. Not everyone can do that. Something. In her tone made me look at her more carefully. Sounds like you speak from experience. She was quiet for a moment, then sat down in the old chair I kept near my desk. I spend my days trying to help people fix their relationships, but I've never been able to fix my own. I was married for 18 years to a man who seemed perfect on paper, doctor. Successful, charming at dinner parties. But he had this way of making me feel like I was always falling short of some standard I couldn't see. I grabbed another chair and sat down across from her, sensing she needed to talk more than she needed me to get back under her car. The divorce was finalized 3 years ago, she continued. I thought I'd feel relieved, and I did for a while. But lately I've been feeling ... stuck. Like I'm waiting for my real life to start. But I don't know what signal I'm waiting for. What kind of signal? I asked. She smiled, but it was a sad smile. I don't know. That's the problem. Help couples communicate better, rebuild trust, find their way back to each other. But when it comes to my own life, I feel like I'm speaking a language I don't understand. I wanted to say something helpful, something that would ease whatever pain she was carrying, but I'd learned over the years that sometimes the best thing you can do is just listen. The irony isn't lost on me, she said with a self-deprecating laugh. The therapist who can't figure out her own life. My colleagues would probably find it amusing if they knew how lost I feel most days. Maybe you're not lost, I said. You're just between destinations. She looked at me with surprise. That's very wise for a mechanic. Cars have taught me a lot about patience, I said. Sometimes you have to take something completely apart before you can understand how to put it back together properly. And sometimes the problem isn't that something's broken, it's just that it needs to be adjusted, calibrated for a different purpose. Ophelia was quiet for a long moment, and I worried I'd overstepped somehow. But then she said, that's the first time in months someone has talked to me like I'm a person instead of a professional. Everyone expects therapists to have all the answers, to be perpetually wise and balanced. It's exhausting. I can imagine, I said. Must be lonely too, always being the one people turn to for help. It is. She looked around the garage at the tools and equipment, the organized chaos of a working space. This is nice, though. Being somewhere where the problems are mechanical, where you can see what's wrong and know how to fix it. I stood up and walked back toward her car. Speaking of which, I should probably figure out what's making that noise before the day gets away from us. She followed me, and as I began examining the engine from below, she said something that would stick with me for the rest of the afternoon. Martin, thank you for listening. I haven't talked about my divorce with anyone in months. There's something about you that makes it easy, to be honest. I looked down at her from my position under the car. Anytime. Sometimes we all need someone who'll just listen without trying to fix everything. What I didn't know then was how much she'd been thinking about our conversation, or how it had been affecting her sleep. 20 minutes under the lift revealed the source of the grinding noise, a failing water pump bearing. It wasn't an emergency, but it would need attention soon. The bearing was starting to seize intermittently, which explained the periodic grinding. Sound Ophelia had been hearing. "Good news and bad news," I told her as I lowered the car back down. "Good news is, it's not catastrophic. Bad news is, your water pump is on its way out." "The bearing's starting to fail." Ophelia nodded, wiping her hands on a paper towel even though she hadn't touched anything dirty. "Eight." It was a nervous gesture. I realized the first sign of anxiety. I'd seen from her all afternoon. "How long do I have?" she asked. "Could be a week, could be a month." But when water pumps fail, they fail fast. One day you're hearing a little grinding, the next day you're overheating on the side of the highway. I pulled up the part on my computer. "I can get the replacement pump tomorrow morning and have you fixed up by afternoon." "That means leaving." "My car overnight? Unless you want to risk it?" I said. "But I wouldn't recommend it. Water pump failure can destroy an engine if you're not careful." She was quiet for a moment, and I could see her working through something in her mind. She said, "I don't like being without my car. I know that probably sounds silly, but after my divorce, having my own transportation became really important to me. Independence, I guess." "It doesn't sound silly at all," I said. "Tell you what, if I've got a loaner car you can borrow. It's not as nice as your BMW, but it's reliable. You'd do that?" "Sure. It's a 2016 Honda Civic. Clean, safe, gets good mileage. I keep it for situations like this." The relief on her face was immediate and profound. "Thank you. That would be perfect." As I went to get the keys for the loaner car, I found myself thinking about what she'd said about independence. There was something in the way she'd talked about needing her own transportation that spoke to a deeper fear, not just of being stranded, but of being dependent on someone else's schedule, someone else's generosity. I understood that feeling. More than I cared to admit. "Here we go," I said, returning with the Honda keys and the paperwork. "It's the blue one parked around back. Full tank of gas, insurance is all handled." As we walked around to look at the loaner car, Ophelia said, "You know, most mechanics I've dealt with in the past treated me like I was trying to waste their time, or like I didn't understand what they were telling me. You're different." "Different? How?" "You explain things without talking down to me. You listen to what I'm saying instead of just waiting for me to stop talking. And you're not trying to upsell me on services I don't need." I opened the Honda's door and checked that everything was clean and ready. I learned a long time ago that treating people with respect is usually the fastest way to build trust, and trust is everything in this business. "It's everything in my business too," she said, sliding into the driver's seat to adjust the mirrors. "Though I have to admit, it's easier to trust someone who's fixing your car than someone who's trying to fix your relationship." "Why's that?" She started the Honda and listened to the engine for a moment before answering. "Because with cars, you can prove whether something works or not. Either the grinding noise stops or it doesn't. Either the engine runs smoothly or it doesn't. With relationships, you can think you fixed something only to discover the problem was deeper than you." Realized as she spoke, I found myself studying her profile. There was something about the afternoon light filtering through the garage. Windows that highlighted the elegant line of her neck, the way her hair caught the sun. I caught myself staring and forced my attention back to the business at hand. "Set?" I asked. "All set," she confirmed, but she didn't immediately put the car in gear. Instead, she looked at me through the open window. "Martin, can I ask you something personal?" "Shoot." "Do you ever feel like you're good at fixing everyone else's problems, but terrible at understanding your own life?" The question hit closer to home than I expected. "Sometimes," I admitted. "I can diagnose a complex engine problem in an hour. But I've been trying to figure out why I'm still single at 38 for years." She smiled at that. 38? I would have guessed younger. "Clean living and good genes," I said with a grin. "Plus, working with my hands keeps me in shape." "Shows," she said, and there was something in her voice that made me look at her more carefully, but then she was back to business. "What time should I be here tomorrow?" "Any time after 2. The part should be in by noon, and the job itself only takes about 3 hours." "Perfect. I have clients until 1:30 anyway." She put the Honda in reverse, then paused again. Martin, thank you for today. Not just for diagnosing the car, but for ... everything else. The conversation, the listening. It meant more than you probably realize. Thank you for trusting me with it, I said. Both the car and the conversation. She drove away in the Honda. I found myself standing in the garage longer than necessary, watching her taillights disappear down the street. There had been something in our afternoon together, a connection, an ease of communication that I hadn't experienced in a long time. I had no way of knowing that Ophelia was thinking the same thing as she drove home, or that our conversation would follow her into her dreams that night in ways that would surprise us both. But as I locked up the garage and headed home myself, I was already looking forward to seeing her again tomorrow. The next day arrived with that crisp clarity that October afternoons in Cedar Falls are famous for. I'd gotten to the shop early, partly because the water pump had arrived ahead of schedule, but mostly because I was looking forward to seeing Ophelia again. Not something I usually admitted to myself about customers, but there was no point in pretending otherwise. By noon, I had her BMW up on the lift with the old water pump removed. The bearing was even worse than I'd initially diagnosed another week or two, and she would have been dealing with a complete failure, probably at the worst possible moment. As I worked, I found myself thinking about our conversation the day before, particularly her comment about feeling stuck between destinations. At exactly 2:15, I heard the familiar sound of the Honda pulling into the lot. Through the garage windows, I watched Ophelia get out and walk toward the entrance. She was wearing a different outfit today, a burgundy sweater over dark pants, professional but softer somehow. She moved with the same confident stride, but there was something else in her posture that I couldn't quite identify. "How's the patient?" she asked, setting her purse down on the same workbench where she'd sat yesterday. "Surgery was successful," I said, wiping my hands and coming down from under the lift. The old water pump was worse than I thought. It caught. It just in time? Good timing, then. She walked over to look at her car, now lowered back to the ground. "How much longer?" "Just need to top off the coolant and run her for a few minutes to make sure everything's sealed properly. Maybe 20 minutes. "Perfect." She settled onto the workbench, but unlike yesterday, she didn't pull out a book or her phone. Dead. She just watched me work, and I became increasingly aware of her attention. "How was your morning?" I asked. As I opened the hood and began adding coolant to the system, "It's busy. 3 couples sessions back to back." She paused, then added, "One of them reminded me of our conversation yesterday." "How so?" "They've been married for 15 years, but they've stopped really seeing each other. They go through the motions of their relationship, but they've lost the ability to connect on anything deeper than logistics. Who's picking up the kids? What's for dinner? Whose turn it is to deal with the broken dishwasher?" I started the engine and listened carefully as it warmed up. No grinding, no unusual noises. Sounds lonely, it is. And the sad part is, they both want to reconnect. They just don't know how to start. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "It made me think about what you said yesterday, about sometimes needing to take something apart before you can put it back together properly. Did it help them?" "I think so. Sometimes people need permission to acknowledge that something isn't working before they can figure out how to fix it." She slid down from the workbench and came to stand beside me as I checked the engine. "Speaking of which, how does she sound?" "Perfect. Smooth as silk." I shut off the engine and began cleaning up my tools. "Good as new, maybe better." "What do you—" "I owe you." I handed her the invoice, and she looked it over carefully before pulling out her checkbook. As she wrote, she said, "Martin, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Yesterday, when we were talking about feeling stuck between destinations, do you think some people are just meant to be alone? Not in a sad way, but in a ... complete way." The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" She finished writing the check and handed it to me. "I mean, what if some people are supposed to learn how to be whole by themselves instead of looking for someone else to complete them? What if the signal I've been waiting for isn't about finding the right person, but about finding the right relationship with myself?" "It's pretty philosophical for a Friday afternoon," I said. But I was thinking about her question seriously. "I guess it's possible, though it seems like it would be a lonely way to live." "Would it, though? Or would it just be different?" She gathered her purse and keys. "Maybe the problem isn't that I'm alone. Maybe the problem is that I think being alone means something's wrong with me. As we walked toward her car, I found myself wanting to extend the conversation, to find a reason for her to stay a little longer. You know, I said, if you ever want to talk through these philosophical questions over coffee sometime, I'm a pretty good listener. She stopped walking and turned to look at me, and for a moment, something passed between us that felt charged. Electric. That's very kind of you, she said softly. But I should probably figure out my own questions before I start involving other people in them. Fair enough, I said, trying not to show my disappointment. But the offer stands. She got into her BMW and started it up, listening with satisfaction to the smooth, quiet engine. Then she rolled down the window. Martin, thank you for everything. You've been ... You've given me a lot to think about. As she drove away, I stood in the garage doorway watching her go, wondering what she meant by a lot to think about, why I suddenly felt like I'd missed an opportunity I didn't even know I was being offered. The weekend passed slowly. Saturday was busy enough at the shop, oil changes, brake work, the usual weekend rush of people trying to catch up on car maintenance they'd been putting off. But Sunday was different. Sundays I usually spent restoring a 1967 Mustang I'd been working on for 3 years. But I found myself distracted, thinking about Ophelia's question about being meant to be alone. By Sunday evening, I'd convinced myself that our connection had been purely professional, a customer who needed someone to listen, a mechanic who happened to be good at that. But then Monday morning arrived with a surprise that changed everything. I was opening up the shop, going through my usual routine of turning on lights and firing up the air compressor, when I noticed a familiar silver BMW parked across the street at Murphy's Diner. Through the large windows, I could see Ophelia sitting alone at a corner booth, nursing what looked like coffee and staring out the window. Murphy's was directly across from my garage, close enough that she had to have seen me arrive, which meant either this was an incredible coincidence or she had deliberately chosen to have breakfast somewhere she knew I'd notice her. I stood in my doorway for a moment, trying to decide what to do. The professional thing would be to leave her alone. She was a customer whose car I'd fixed, nothing more. But something about the way she sat there, the careful casualness of it, made me think she might be hoping I'd notice. After an internal debate that lasted about 30 seconds, I locked up the shop and walked across the street. The bell above Murphy's door chimed as I entered, and Ophelia looked up from her coffee cup with what seemed like genuine surprise. Oh, I suspected it might have been carefully practiced. Martin, she said, smiling. What a coincidence. Is it?
Asked.
Sliding into the booth across from her. Coincidence, I mean. She laughed, and there was something different about her today. Less guarded, maybe. Maybe not entirely. I was hoping you might come over and say hello. Mission accomplished. I signaled to Dolores, the waitress who'd been working at Murphy's since before I moved to Cedar Falls. Coffee, please. You're probably wondering why I'm sitting here staring at your garage like some kind of stalker, Ophelia said, stirring her coffee even though it didn't need stirring. The thought had crossed my mind. She was quiet for a moment, and I could see her working up the courage to say something. I haven't been sleeping well since Friday. Car trouble keeping you up? No, the car's perfect. She paused, took a sip of coffee, then looked directly at me. It's you, actually. Dolores arrived with my coffee at exactly the wrong moment, filling the silence with cheerful small talk about the weather and did I want my usual breakfast order. I waited until she moved on to ask, what about me? I've been having dreams, Ophelia said quietly. Every night since Friday, dreams about you. I felt something shift in my chest, a tightening that had nothing to do with caffeine. What kind of dreams? Not romantic dreams, she said quickly, as if she'd anticipated that question. Well, not exactly. They single quotes read ... complicated. In them, you're always fixing something. My car, my kitchen sink, my back fence. But it's more than that. You're fixing things in my life that I didn't even know were broken. I took a sip of coffee, buying time to process what she was telling me. That's unusual. It's more than unusual. It's unprecedented. She leaned forward slightly. Martin, I'm a therapist. I know about dreams, about projection and transference, and all the psychological mechanisms that could explain this. But these dreams feel different. They feel ... significant. Significant how? In Friday night's dream, you fixed my water pump, and then somehow, you fixed my relationship with my sister. We haven't spoken in 2 years, but in the dream, after you repaired my car, I called her. And we talked for hours. I wasn't sure what to say to that. Did you actually call her? Saturday morning, we talked for 3 hours, but it was a complicated smile. It's the first real conversation we've had since our father's funeral. Wow. That's great. Saturday night, you fixed my garbage disposal and then helped me understand why my marriage failed. Not in a way that made me angry or bitter, but in a way that made me grateful for what I learned from it. I was beginning to understand why she'd been sitting across from my garage staring through the window. And last night was different. She paused, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug like she was drawing warmth from it. Last night, you didn't fix anything mechanical. You just sat with me on my back porch and we talked. About everything, about nothing. And when I woke up, I realized something. What? I realized I'd been waiting for someone to fix me, when what I really needed was someone who would just ... see me, without trying to change anything or solve anything.
See me.
The diner suddenly felt very quiet, despite the usual breakfast crowd. Ophelia. I know this is crazy, she said. I know I'm probably projecting or transferring or doing any number of things my professional training should prevent me from doing. But I had to tell you, because these dreams are telling me something important, and I think you're part of it. I sat there across from Ophelia in Murphy's diner, trying to process what she'd just told me. Around us, the normal sounds of breakfast continued clinking silverware. Coffee cups being refilled, the low murmur of morning conversation, but it all felt distant, like background noise to something much more important happening at our corner. Booth, when you say the dreams feel significant, I said carefully, what exactly do you mean? Ophelia looked down at her hands, then back up at me. I mean, they feel more real than my actual life has felt in months. I wake up with this sense of ... possibility. Like maybe I'm not as stuck as I thought I was. You think I'm part of that somehow? I don't know what to think. That's why I'm sitting here instead of handling this like a rational adult and forgetting about it. She gave a self-deprecating laugh. Do you know how many times I've told clients that dreams are just our subconscious processing the events of our day? That they're symbolic, not literal? But these feel different. These feel like instructions. The weight of that statement settled. Between us, I took another sip of coffee, stalling while I tried to figure out how to respond. This was uncharted territory for was good at diagnosing mechanical problems, not psychological ones. Can I ask you something? I said finally. Of course. What is it you think needs fixing? In your life, I mean. She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her shifting into therapist mode, analyzing her own thoughts before speaking them. I think I've been living like I'm waiting for permission to be happy, like there's some external validation I need before I'm allowed to enjoy my life. Permission from who? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? She smiled ruefully. My ex-husband, maybe. My parents, who never understood why I chose therapy over law school. My colleagues, who expect me to have all the answers. Maybe. Even my clients, who see me as someone who has her life figured out. Do you think you need permission? No. Intellectually, I know I don't. But emotionally, that's harder to untangle. She paused, then added, in the dreams, when you're fixing things, you never ask for permission. You just do what needs to be done. And somehow that gives me permission to do the same. I found myself leaning forward, drawn into her analysis, despite my lack of training in this area. So what would you do if you gave yourself permission? I mean, I don't know. And that's terrifying, she laughed, but it wasn't entirely happy. I've spent so much energy being who I thought I should be that I'm not sure who I actually am underneath. All that. Maybe that's what the dreams are trying to show you, I said. It's not who you should be, but who you already are when you stop trying so hard. She looked at me with surprise. That's very insightful for someone who claims not to understand psychology. Cars have taught me that sometimes the problem isn't that something's broken. It's that it's being forced to work in a way it wasn't designed for. Meaning maybe you're not stuck. Maybe you're just trying to be something you're not. Ophelia stared at me for a moment, and I worried I'd overstepped. But then she said, "You know what's strange?
Ow!
That's exactly the kind of thing. Is that good or bad? I'm not sure yet." She glanced at her watch, then back at me. I should go. I have a client at 10. As she gathered her purse and stood up, I found myself not wanting the conversation to end. "Ophelia, can I ask you something else?" "Sure. Why did you tell me about the dreams?" "I mean, you could have just kept having them and worked through whatever they mean on your own." She paused, her hand on the back of the booth. "Because in every dream, after you fix whatever's broken, you look at me and say, 'Sometimes the most.' Important repairs happen when you're brave enough to ask for help. And you think telling me about the dreams is asking for help. I think telling you about the dreams is the first honest thing I've done in months." She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Whether that's asking for help or just asking for understanding, I'm not sure. As she headed toward the door, she turned back one more time. "Martin, thank you for listening. Again, you seem to be making a habit of that." "Anytime," I said, and meant it, after she left. I sat in the booth for another 10 minutes, finishing my coffee and trying to understand. What had just happened? A woman I'd met 3 days ago had just told me she'd been dreaming about me every night. And instead of feeling uncomfortable or flattered or confused, I felt ... honored, like she'd trusted me with something precious. I had no idea that her confession was just the beginning, or that she had more to tell me than she'd been brave enough to share. The rest of Monday passed in a haze of routine work that couldn't quite distract me from thinking about Ophelia's dreams. By Tuesday morning, I'd convinced myself that our conversation at Murphy's had been a one-time thing, a moment of vulnerability that she'd probably regretted by now. But at 11:30, my phone rang. "Martin, it's Ophelia. Hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all. Is everything okay with your car?" "The car's perfect. But I was wondering if you might have time for lunch today. There's something else I need to show you." Something in her voice, a mix of nervousness and determination, made me clear my afternoon schedule without hesitation. We agreed to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, away from the usual Cedar Falls lunch crowd. When I arrived, Ophelia was already seated at a corner table, and I immediately noticed the notebook beside her coffee cup. It was small, leather-bound, the kind someone might use for journaling or important thoughts. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down. "I know this is all very strange." "Strange doesn't begin to cover it," I admitted, "but I'm curious." She placed her hand on the notebook almost protectively. "After we talked yesterday, I went home and did something I haven't done in years. I started writing down my dreams. Not just the ones about you, but all of them." "What did you find?" "That I've been having dreams about you longer than I initially realized." She opened the notebook, and I could see pages covered in neat handwriting. "I thought it started Friday night, but when I really focused on it, remembered having a dream about you the night after I first brought my car in. Thursday night? Thursday night. It was vague, then just an impression of someone who knew how to fix things. Someone who made me feel ... safe. But then Friday night. After our longer conversation, the dreams became much more specific." She turned a few pages and began reading. "Friday night, Martin fixed my water pump, then helped me call my sister. We talked about forgiveness and second chances. Saturday night, Martin repaired my garbage disposal, then sat with me while I went through photo albums from my marriage. Sunday night, no mechanical repairs, just talking on my back porch about what it means to start over. And last night," Ophelia looked up from the notebook, and I saw something vulnerable in her expression. "Last night was different, more intense." Wow. "So, Monday night, you didn't fix anything at all? We were just ... top together. Walking through downtown Cedar Falls. talking about our lives, our fears, our hopes. And at the end of the dream, you asked me a question that woke me up. What question? She took a breath. You asked me if I thought it was wrong to have feelings for someone I barely knew. The cafe suddenly felt very quiet. I could hear the espresso machine hissing in the background, but everything else seemed muted. And what did you say? In the dream. I said I didn't know, but that maybe the heart doesn't follow the same timeline as the mind. She closed the notebook. And then I woke up, and I realized that wasn't Dream Martin asking that question. That was me asking myself. I reached for my coffee, buying time to process what she was telling me. Ophelia, ... Double quotes. I know this is crazy. I know I'm probably experiencing some kind of transference or projection or any number of psychological phenomena that would make perfect sense if you were my therapist and I were your client. But you're not my therapist. You're just ... you. What exactly are you saying? She looked directly at me, and I saw her professional composure slip away entirely. I'm saying that in 4 days you've made me feel more understood than I felt. In 18 years of marriage, I'm saying that a man I met less than a week ago has somehow become the most honest conversation I have, if it's only in my dreams. And that scares you? Terrifies me, she admitted. Because I'm 51 years old, Martin. I'm supposed to have figured out how relationships work by now. I'm supposed to be past the point of having intense dreams about virtual strangers. Maybe age doesn't have anything to do with it, I said. Maybe some connections just happen on their own timeline? She smiled at that. You sound like Dream Martin again. Is that good or bad? It's confusing. Because it makes me wonder if my subconscious knows something my conscious mind is afraid to acknowledge. Which is, she was quiet for a moment, then said that maybe I've been waiting for someone like you without even knowing it. Someone who listens without trying to fix me, who sees me without trying to change me. And that's a problem because I don't know the difference between genuine connection and wishful thinking anymore. Because I'm terrified of making another mistake. As she spoke, I found myself wanting to reach across the table and take her hand, to tell her that, whatever. This was between us. It didn't feel like a mistake. But I also understood her fear. What if we took it slowly? I heard myself say, what if we figured it out together? Ophelia stared at me across the cafe table, and I could see her wrestling with something internal. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. You know what the hardest part of my job is? She asked. I shook my head. It's watching people sabotage their own happiness because they're afraid of being vulnerable. I see it every day, couples who love each other, but won't risk saying so. Individuals who know what they want, but convince themselves they don't deserve it. She laughed, but it was a bitter sound. And here I am, doing exactly the same thing.
Oh.
Are you sabotaging your happiness? By analyzing this to death instead of just ... experiencing it? By sitting here cataloging all the reasons why this doesn't make sense, instead of acknowledging that maybe it doesn't need to make sense. I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. What would you tell a client who was in your situation? That's the irony, isn't it? I'd tell them to trust their instincts. I'd tell them that connection doesn't follow a schedule or a rule book. I'd tell them that overthinking is just fear dressed up as wisdom. And what are your instincts telling you? She was quiet for a long moment, then said, that you're different. That talking to you feels like coming home to a place I've never been before. She paused. But my instincts had been wrong before. With your ex-husband? With my ex-husband. I convinced myself that logic and compatibility were enough. He looked good on paper, successful, stable, socially appropriate. We had the same goals, the same 5-year plan. It took me 15 years to realize that none of that mattered if we couldn't actually talk to each other. And now?
Well,
having the opposite problem, meeting someone I can talk to about anything, someone who makes me feel seen and understood. But my logical brain is screaming that it's too fast, too intense, too risky. I reached across the table and touched her hand. It was the first time we'd had any physical contact, and I felt a small electric shock at the connection. What if we ignored both the logic and the fear for a minute?
gosh.
Focused on what feels true? What feels true? That I look forward to seeing you? That our conversations are the most interesting part of my day? That I've never met anyone who could make me think about fixing things as a metaphor for healing? She turned her hand over so our palms were touching. What feels true is that I haven't felt this curious about someone in years. That the dreams aren't really about you fixing things, they're about you seeing me clearly enough to know what needs attention. And what needs attention. My fear of wanting something I might not be able to have. My habit of protecting myself so well that I forget to live. She squeezed my hand gently. My tendency to think that being 51 means I've missed my chance for unexpected connections. Maybe. I said 51 is exactly the right age to stop worrying about what makes sense and start paying attention to what makes you happy. Can I tell you what I'm really afraid of? Ophelia asked, her hand still touching mine across the cafe table. Please. I'm afraid that I'm using you as a symbol instead of seeing you as a person. She pulled her hand back and wrapped it around her coffee cup. In my profession, we call it projection, taking our own unresolved issues and placing them onto someone else, making them represent something they never asked to represent. I considered that. What do you think you're making me represent? Hope, maybe, or possibility? The idea that it's not too late to feel something real? She met my eyes. And that's not fair to you, because it puts pressure on you to be something perfect instead of just being yourself. What if I told you I don't feel pressured? What if I told you that might be part of the problem? She smiled sadly. You're being remarkably patient with a woman who's essentially told you she's been dreaming about you every night. Most people would be running for the hills by now. Maybe I'm not most people. That's exactly what I mean. So steady, so accepting. It makes me wonder if you're real or if I've somehow imagined you into existence because I needed someone exactly like you. I leaned forward. Ophelia, what if we approach this differently? What if instead of trying to figure out what this means, we just try to understand what it is? What do you mean? I mean, forget about the dreams for a minute. Forget about projection and transference and all the psychological terms. Just tell me what's happening for you right now in this moment. She was quiet for a long time. I could see her visibly setting aside her professional training, trying to access something more fundamental. Right now, she said slowly, I feel more awake than I have in months. Like I've been sleepwalking through my life, and suddenly there's someone worth paying attention to. That doesn't sound like projection to me. That sounds like attraction. But how can I trust that? How can I trust my own feelings when they're so intense, so quickly? Maybe the intensity isn't the problem. Maybe the problem is that you've been taught to distrust anything that feels too good too fast. She looked at me with surprise. Where did that come from? From watching you analyze yourself instead of just experiencing what's happening between us? From seeing you apologize for having feelings that most people would consider a gift? A gift? Someone dreams about you every night. Someone who's intelligent and thoughtful and brave enough to tell you about it instead of just keeping it to herself. Someone who makes you feel awake and alive. Yeah, I'd call that a gift. Ow. Tears gathered. In her eyes, you make it sound so simple. Maybe it is simple. Maybe we've just been trained to think it should be complicated. And what if it doesn't work out? What if we try this and I disappoint you? Or you realize I'm not who you thought I was? Then we'll figure it out together. But what if we don't try and spend the rest of our lives wondering what might have been? Ophelia wiped her eyes with her napkin, and when she looked at me again, something had shifted. The careful professional composure was gone, replaced by something raw and more honest. You know what's funny? She said. I spend my days helping people navigate exactly this kind of situation. The fear of vulnerability, the tendency to overthink instead of feel, the paralysis that comes from wanting to control outcomes instead of trusting the process. And what do you tell them? I tell them that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's feeling the fear and choosing to move forward anyway. I tell them that uncertainty is the price of admission for anything meaningful. She laughed softly. I tell them all the things I'm apparently incapable of applying to my own life. Maybe you're applying them right now, I said. By telling me about the dreams, by sitting here having this conversation, by admitting you're scared. That all sounds pretty courageous to me. Does it? 'Cause it feels like I'm falling apart? Sometimes falling apart is how we make room for something better to take shape. She stared at me. Did you just quote therapy back at me? Did it work? Unfortunately, yes. No. She smiled through her tears. You know, there's something you said yesterday that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. What's that? You said maybe I'm not stuck. Maybe I'm just trying to be something I'm not. And I've been wondering, what if the thing I'm trying to be is someone who has it all figured out? And what if you stop trying to be that? I'd have to admit that I'm just as confused and hopeful and terrified as everyone else. I'd have to admit that a 51-year-old therapist can still be surprised by her own feelings. Would that be so terrible? It would be human. She closed her eyes for a moment. You know what I realized this morning when I was writing in that journal? What? The dreams aren't really about you fixing things. They're about you accepting things as they are. In every dream, you look at whatever's broken and you don't judge it or try to make it something it's not. You just ... work with what's there, and that's what you need. Someone who works with what's there. I think that's what I've always needed. Someone who sees my imperfection. And what if you stop trying to be that? I'd have to admit that I'm just as confused and hopeful and terrified as everyone else. I'd have to admit that a 51-year-old therapist can still be surprised by her own feelings. Would that be so terrible? It would be human. She closed her eyes for a moment. You know what I realized this morning when I was writing in that journal? What? The dreams aren't really about you fixing things. They're about you accepting things as they are. In every dream, you look at whatever's broken and you don't judge it or try to make it something it's not. You just ... work with what's there, and that's what you need. Someone who works with what's there. I think that's what I've always needed. Someone who sees my imperfections and doesn't immediately start planning how to improve them. She opened her eyes. My ex-husband was constantly trying to optimize me. My career, my social skills, my appearance, my personality. He meant well, but living with someone who thinks you need upgrading is exhausting. What would it feel like to be with someone who thinks you're already enough? I don't know, she said quietly. I've never tried it. Maybe, I said, reaching across the table to take her hand again. That's what we're both here to figure out. If I told you something that might change your mind about me, try me. She took a deep breath. What if I told you that last night's dream was different from all the others? What if I told you that for the first time, I dreamed about touching you, and I woke up wanting it to be real? The confession hung in the air between us, and I could see Ophelia immediately regretting her honesty. She started to pull her hand away, but I held it gently. Thank you for telling me, I said. You're not running away? Should I be? Most people would think it's too much, too fast. A woman you've known for less than a week admitting she's having romantic dreams about you. I'm not most people, I said again. And honestly, I've been thinking about you too. Not in dreams, but during the day. Wondering what you're doing, what you're thinking. Looking forward to seeing you again. She searched my face. Really? Really? The difference is, you've been brave enough to acknowledge it. I've been pretending it was just professional interest. And now? I think we're both past pretending. Ophelia was quiet for a moment, then said, So what do we do with this? Two adults who barely know each other, but somehow feel connected in ways that don't make logical sense. We take it one day at a time. See what happens when we stop analyzing it and start experiencing it. That's terrifying. Good things usually are, she smiled. And for the first time since I'd met her, it was completely unguarded. You know what the strangest part is? In all my dreams about you, you never tell me what to do or how to feel. You just ... create space for me to figure it out myself. Maybe that's what you've been missing. Space to just be yourself, without someone trying to direct the process. And what about you? What have you been missing? I thought about that. Connection, I guess. Real conversation with someone who sees beneath the surface. Most of the women I've dated wanted to change me or fix me or turn me into someone more ambitious, more social, more ... something. What if I told you I like you exactly as you are? I'd probably ask you to prove it. How? Have dinner with me. Not as a customer, not as someone working through psychological issues. Just as Ophelia and Martin seeing what happens when we stop overthinking everything. She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her wrestling with the decision. And finally, she said, "Okay, but I have one condition." "What's that?" "If we do this, we do it honestly. No pretending to be more put." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.